If you remember, at the end of Josef von Sternberg's The Case of Lena Smith, Lena rescues her son Franz from an orphanage in Vienna and takes him home to her small town in Hungary. There is then an epilogue taking place almost 15 years in the future, during the summer of 1914, and her son is now going off to fight in the war. We are told that despite all of her struggles, sacrifices, sufferings, and hopes, Lena has lost her son after all. Well, that is not the Lena Smith we saw in the film. She was not willing to let the authorities in Vienna take her son away from her, and she would certainly not let the army do it either. After all, even when she was a little girl, it was easy to see that Lena had a strong personality and would do whatever was necessary to protect her own. The original film obviously called out for this sequel. Within days after her return with little Franz to her village in Hungary, Lena married Stefan, her childhood sweetheart. They had a lavish Hungarian country wedding. It was the happiest day of her life. After all of her struggles in Vienna to keep her son, it was wonderful for her to be home again with people she loved. During her time in Vienna, Stefan had become a very important man in the town. And so, Stefan and Lena began a wonderful life together. Stefan was a perfect father for little Franz, but he wanted children of his own, so Lena had two more sons, Rolf and Josef. Once, Stefan went to Paris on business. He brought back wide-brimmed hats for the boys. He said they were all the rage in Paris. Rolf and Josef liked wearing them, but Franz took his off whenever possible. Stefan said that was the Austrian coming out in him. And then, in 1914, the good times ended. World War I started. Lena remembered in great detail the day she and Stefan saw Franz off at the train station. That was the worst day of her life. She had lost Franz once when he was little, and now she was losing him again when he was barely a man. She just couldn't accept that. Everyone at their dusty train station seemed so happy. Even the soldiers were singing. Lena couldn't understand it. Didn't they know where they were going? She frantically waved goodbye to Franz as the military transport train disappeared from view. She then slumped down onto a bench. Stefan sat down beside her. They were surrounded by parents hugging their young sons as they waited for the next train. Why couldn't Franz go with the second train? Lena asked. It's only 20 minutes, Lena, Stefan replied. Besides, as the chief military official here, I was able to get Franz sent off with the older recruits. This should get him easier duty. Lena persisted. His father was a lieutenant. Shouldn't that get him some consideration? Stefan explained. Lena, his father died 15 years ago. Anyway, his greatest accomplishments in life seem to have been fathering an illegitimate child, accumulating gambling debts, and committing suicide. Hardly a record to impress anyone. A few weeks later, Lena was peeling potatoes as Stefan read a letter from Franz. He spoke hesitantly. He's been sent to Shul to strengthen the garrison. It's a fortress, right? Lena asked. That should be safe. No, Lena, not now. Shul is our last hope to hold back the Russians. It cannot fall. I'm afraid the fighting there will be heavy. At first, the garrison was able to repulse the Russian attack, but with the new year and winter came the bad news. A postcard arrived from Shul, and each soldier from the village had been allowed to put a short message on it. It was clear that the Russians had not only returned, but had besieged the fortress, and the situation was becoming more dire day by day. Franz was well, but very afraid. Almost frantic with worry, Lena stumbled along the streets of her village. She knew she couldn't just sit at home, peeling potatoes and waiting to get the letter saying Franz was dead. She knew she had to do something. Just after she'd returned to her village with little Franz, Lena had seen Georges Méliès's film, Voyage to the Moon. Because of that, she always looked up at full moons, and this night was no exception. She couldn't believe what she saw. Franz and his father entwined as one. Lena took this as an omen, the first of many. She decided to become a nurse and go to the fortress. She went to Vienna to ask Franz's grandfather for his help. She found him at his son's grave, in a corner of the cemetery reserved for upper-class suicides. Franz's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross. Lena explained who she was. Hofrat Holtz's only comment was that he was too old and tired to be angry with her. Lena put white roses on Franz's grave. I haven't come to anger you, Lena explained. I've come about your grandson. He's grown up to be a wonderful young man. The Hofrat nodded. Lena showed him photos of Franz. He's at Shul, sir. The garrison there is in a very bad situation. The Hofrat nodded. A good-looking boy, he muttered. Definitely Franz's son. I need to go there, sir, Lena pleaded. I must save him. Please help me. I'm no longer a Hofrat. Maybe not, but you know who is. That's true, he said, and shook his head. That night, Lena had a dream of Franz's father. His face appeared among the roses she'd placed on his grave, scattered on a field of blood. Lena was surprised. It was all so long ago. But he had, after all, been her first love. And so, Lena flew to Shul in a small plane in a thunderstorm. Nevertheless, she could clearly see the Russians surrounding the city. In later years, Lena would always say that from the minute that plane took off in mid-February 1915, she had always been in a struggle with the fourth element. After her arrival in Shemashul, Lena went straight to the hospital, where she went from bed to bed, frantically looking for Franz. She didn't find him. After being pushed from office to office, Lena finally found out that Franz was on the perimeter of the fortress and couldn't be reached. Very few patients in the hospital had been wounded. Most of the officers had gonorrhea, and most of the soldiers were simply exhausted and starving. The food supply in Shemashul was so bad that not only the rats, but also the horses were being eaten. A joke of the time had it that the difference between Troy and Shemashul is that in Troy, the soldiers were in the horse, but in Shemashul, the horses were in the soldiers. Finally, the Defense Council of the fortress decided that they would surrender on March 22nd. The city had been bombarded for days by heavy artillery and even by shells dropped from airplanes. Anything and everything of military value was destroyed, even the money. The last night was like the destruction of Pompeii. The city seemed to be surrounded by volcanoes. All ammunition, including artillery shells, was either fired or detonated. All three bridges across the River San were blown up. In the city, windows shattered and plaster fell from walls. Citizens left their homes, fearing that the shock wave would cause them to collapse. By 7 a.m., the soldiers, exhausted and their weapons destroyed, waited for the Russians to march into the city. By 9 a.m., they were there. By all accounts, the Russians were friendly, even sharing their tobacco. In an act of generosity, the Austro-Hungarian officers were allowed to keep their swords, as a sign of respect for the length of their resistance. Lena searched the streets of the city, desperately looking for Franz. On the verge of despair, she wandered into a bombed-out church where she found a headless Madonna and Child. The damaged statue reminded her of everything she had already been through, and this gave her strength. But what really transformed her was a crucifix she came upon, barely standing in a second ruined church. The thought of the Mater Dolorosa, inconsolable after losing her son, filled Lena with energy and resolve, the energy not to mourn, but to search all of Russia, if necessary, to find her son. The Hungarian prisoners, more feared and despised by the Russians than any others, were quickly taken from Shemashul, driven like cattle to the rail station at Lviv, and then taken in boxcars to Kiev, where they were registered and sent on to other camps throughout Russia. Lena arrived in Kiev somewhat later with the wounded prisoners. She found out that the Hungarians had been sent to Murmansk in the far northwest of Russia to build the vital railway connecting that city with St. Petersburg. The kindly hospital commander arranged for Lena to go there, unable to understand why anyone would volunteer to go to Murmansk. Lena arrived at the prison camp in the beginning of June 1915. To her relief, Franz was not in the hospital. She did, however, see him marching to and from work. He was a walking skeleton. His mustache was gone, and his eyes had a wild look, but Lena still recognized him. Depending on his mood, Franz would either shave or grow his mustache, but his wild eyes remained, at least in Lena's opinion. The two of them showed no sign of knowing one another. Probably a good idea, Lena thought. At the end of August, however, Franz was admitted to the hospital. His hand had been crushed by a hammer. Lena knew they had to escape. Franz was no longer of any use to the Russians. They would no doubt let him die. Just after the 1st of September, their chance came. It was a Sunday, incredibly warm for the far north. So much so that the soldiers and favored prisoners went swimming in the local river. For the first time, Lena realized just how magical Northwest Russia could be. That night, just after sunset, Lena saw Franz's face in the full moon, covered in blood red. She knew she had to act. And then the camp was bathed in a strange, pulsing blue light, a light that Lena had never seen before, but which she took for yet another omen. But that was just the beginning. The temperature plunged during the night. It began to snow, and an elk, through flashes of lightning, showed Lena the way into the forest. Lena sneaked into the hospital, found Franz's bed, and just like she had at the orphanage in Vienna, she picked him up, threw him over her shoulder, and they escaped into the blue light. At first, Lena followed the railroad tracks heading south, but not for long. She figured that if they were going to be followed, it would be there. The lone guard stood as if transfixed as Lena and Franz hurried past. Another miracle. Soon, Lena was trudging through deep snow, still carrying Franz. She knew that the Russians considered escape through the dense forest impossible, and they made sure that the prisoners knew it too. Luckily, however, she found a path. At daybreak, Lena slowed down, realizing that they were safe, that they hadn't been followed, and that they were on their way home. And a little smile came to her lips. Overnight, the snow and the blue light had strangely disappeared, and so they walked for a few days through the forest, their hunger growing more and more acute. Lena had a bit of bread, but that was soon eaten. One night, the blue light returned. Lena always saw fog as lost souls roaming the world. Little did she know that she and Franz were about to enter a very curious realm of the dead. The next morning, this is what awaited them. Lena never forgot it for the rest of her life. She and Franz were trying to figure out what to do when a voice behind them explained, "Don't worry, she's just a ghost, sort of a scarecrow, really. She's just lamenting her fiancé, buried under that tree." That voice was Masha's, who is the seated woman on this photograph. She, Anna, and their children took Lena and Franz in. They were the first people that Lena and Franz had seen since their escape, and Lena was naturally worried about how she and Franz would be received. After all, they were still in Russia. Well, she needn't have been concerned. There was no love lost between these women and the Russian army. Their husbands had been taken away in 1914, and they doubted they'd ever see them again. Masha and Anna supported themselves with their cemetery forest, where trees replaced headstones, and their roots pierced the hearts of the dead. And the trees grew, the patterns of their branches revealing the characters of those buried beneath. Of course, plots in this cemetery weren't free. People from as far away as Moscow would bring their dead to this cemetery, bury them, wait a few years, then return to see what kind of people their loved ones had really been. Anna pointed out that the branches of all trees tell stories, not just those with roots boring through human hearts. And then there were the crows, the most spiritual of birds, attracted to the ghostly trees. The birds were all around the cemetery, but not in it. Lena had never seen so many in one place before. Crows would follow Lena and Franz throughout their journey. One day, Anna explained that crows are very sensitive to all ghosts, but especially to those not at peace. They're even sensitive to the spirits of dead crows, she added. How do you know? Lena asked. Come with me. Anna took Lena to the trees just beyond the cemetery. They were full of crows. The sky was a strange yellowish color. Lena never ceased to be amazed by the bizarre colors of the sky in Russia. Anna then threw an old black shoe onto the ground. Within seconds, the crows looked at the shoe, took flight, and began cawing in what must have been anger or fear. You see, Anna explained, they think the shoe's the spirit of an evil crow. They're afraid of it. Anything black about the size of one of them will produce the same reaction. In the end, after enjoying the hospitality of Masha, Anna, and their daughters for more than a month, as far as Lena could tell, Lena and Franz joined a convoy of fur smugglers heading south. Lena helped as a nurse during their journey. Franz was now in good shape again. His hand was still weak, but getting better every day. These people also had no interest in the war. It just wasn't part of their lives. Lena and Franz left the convoy at Lake Ladoga, just north of St. Petersburg. Now this just isn't any lake. It's the largest lake entirely in Europe and is larger than Kuwait. They arrived in December, and strangely enough, the lake hadn't frozen yet. Most members of the convoy got on this ship to travel farther south. Lena and Franz didn't join them. Lena just had a feeling, and that turned out to have been a wise decision. And so, they stole a boat and started rowing down the lake. Lena still worried about stealing things, but Franz was well past such petty concerns. One of them would row while the other slept or fished. They had to stay well away from shore, both to stay safe and because the water was already frozen there. This wasn't a real problem, though, because the lake was full of small islands where they could sleep at night. Around Christmas time, Lena reckoned, they woke up one morning and knew the ice was coming, and that they had to get to shore as soon as possible. They ended up having to slide their boat on solid ice for several hundred meters, but finally they reached shore at the bottom of a cliff. They hid their boat as best they could and luckily found a path leading up to dry land. Luck was still with them, and they found shelter with this circus troupe, living together in this house to escape the war. They were a circus act that in better times had performed both in Hungary and at the Prater in Vienna, so Lena had a lot to talk to them about. Franz wanted to continue their journey over land, but Lena insisted that they spend the winter with the circus people, and so they did. One day, Lena noticed that the house, and yard even, seemed to be strangely empty. She found Zoran, the head of the family, and asked him about it. Where had everyone gone, she wanted to know. After all, the house seemed to be very isolated. Zoran looked up and smiled. "Oh, they're still here," he said. "They've just made themselves invisible. They probably want some quiet time. Or in some cases, they've got some mischief in mind." "I keep forgetting," he went on, "that you civilians are mostly ignorant of the magic." "The magic?" Lena asked. "By that I mean the knowledge that we performers have. Not everything you see in the circus is sleight of hand, after all. And you know, a performer having stage presence is no accident." And so, Zoran taught Lena the art of making yourself invisible. He explained that it's all about the energy emitted by your body as affected by the 4 elements. In a way, you already know this, he said. Most people want more energy, not less. And where do they get it? From food and drink, of course. And what are food and drink but products of the 4 elements? And just as the elements could give you energy, they can also take it away. You know how it often happens that some days, as you walk down the street, everyone seems to notice you. On others, hardly anyone does. Well, these are simply results of the amount of energy you're emitting. A lot of energy, everyone sees you. Less energy, hardly anyone does. And if you can reduce the energy to 0, you become invisible. We just have to teach you how to reduce your energy using the elements. Because it was winter, Zoran began by showing Lena how to take handfuls of snow, and by emptying her mind and concentrating on the snow as it melted and dripped away, so also would her energy. She also learned how to use the wind and even mud in a similar way. Using fire was an advanced technique that Zoran was reluctant to teach Lena. In the end, Lena was able to make herself disappear almost at will. The length of her invisibility depended upon how much of an element she used to suck her energy away. Franz was unfortunately unable to focus his mind enough to learn this. Lena believed that this was the result of his war experience. But there was one problem, Lena thought. How could she do this without needing to eat and drink to have the energy to continue traveling? "No problem," Zoran laughed. "All you need is some of our powder." "Powder?" Lena asked. "Yes, it's really only dried and powdered mare's milk, but it gives you strength without energy or the need to eat and drink for days on end. It's an old trick the so-called barbarian Asian horsemen brought to Europe during their invasions centuries ago." One day, in January 1916, Lena was levitating another skill she learned from the circus troupe, and saw Stefan's face in the clouds. At first they were fair weather clouds, but soon became very dark. To be honest, she hadn't thought about Stefan in weeks, but for Lena, such an occurrence was an omen, pure and simple. And this feeling was reinforced a few days later, when the shivering lights returned over the lake, with Stefan in the clouds above. The ice was melting, and Lena knew that it was time for them to go, to continue on their way home. With Stefan still in the clouds, Lena and Franz said goodbye to the circus people, and, provided with a good supply of powdered mare's milk, they set off, rowing down the lake again. It was March when they reached the end of the lake and headed south on foot, making sure to steer clear of St. Petersburg, where, Lena was sure, there would be no further indifference to the war and the fact that she and Franz were Hungarian. Spring had come early to Russia. There were even flowers and occasionally something to eat to supplement the mare's milk. All in all, this was a fairly happy time for Lena and Franz. And then they met Andras, a fellow Hungarian, and his dancing bear. He was heading north to escape the war. He told Lena that the Russians were planning an offensive at Lake Narok, not far south. Lena explained that she and Franz had to continue to get home to her husband and 2 other sons. Andras quietly told her that her husband might not be there. All men under 50 had been called up for military service. But Lena stubbornly insisted on continuing south. She just couldn't forget the poor dancing bear. As a farmer's wife, married to Stefan, animals were just part of the landscape, nothing special. But that seemed ages ago. Now the sight of the captive and suffering bear was almost unendurable for her and spurred her on ever farther south. And the war caught up with them soon enough. Andras hadn't been kidding about the Battle of Lake Narok, and Franz was fascinated by it. Far from being a victim of shell shock, he constantly tried to steer Lena nearer to the fighting so that he could see what was going on. All the more so when it became clear that the Germans were going to win. Sometimes, Lena had to use her ability to make herself invisible to help Franz get through military checkpoints. But not always. They were able to avoid the Russian checkpoints, and all the guards had to do with the German sentry posts was look at Franz's rather ill-shaped hand, and they would let him pass. Every once in a while, though, they would want Franz to report for duty somewhere. That's when the invisible Lena would step in, prodding, hitting, and goosing the guards into dropping their rifles, which Lena quickly picked up and shot into the air as Franz escaped. It was like slapstick comedy. In the end, though, overtaken by exhaustion, they sought shelter. They came upon a town named Litnamesk that was rapidly becoming deserted. Lena and Franz stood by the side of the road and watched wagon after wagon filled with prized possessions and desperate people rushing into the countryside. No one seemed to want anything more to do with the war. And so, Lena and Franz waited until the streets were empty and then entered the town that seemed to belong to them, except for a few stray dogs and the crows. They were there too, of course. They had their choice of houses, and Lena chose this one, heavily damaged but still livable on the inside. She chose it because of the family photo she found on the floor just inside the front door, obviously dropped during a hasty departure. As Lena fell into a dusty bed, she couldn't get the photo out of her mind, especially how the young women were looking at the young men, who were looking away from them, outside the picture. And this observation planted the seed that soon became a monster that Lena couldn't ignore. Suddenly she realized that all of her visions were of men who were demanding something from her. First Franz the father, then Franz the son, and now Stefan. And these thoughts were only strengthened by what she saw in the ruins of the church in the town. There she found a strange altar, covered with skulls and surrounded by thousands of bones. The skulls all looked the same, men and women stacked together indiscriminately. But then, just a bit farther on, there was a Madonna standing among the ruins, reassuring Lena, just as she had in Shemashul, that everything was possible. This one was different, though. She was alone, not holding a child. And for just an instant, well, maybe a bit more, Lena longed to be alone, to only be responsible for herself, and not subject to the needs and expectations of men. That night, reality came crashing in. Lena had a dream about her 3 sons and the carousel in her town. Franz, of course, was with her. But what about Rolf and Josef? What had become of them, especially if their father was no longer at home? Unable to sleep, Lena went for a walk in the moonlight. And there, as she knew he would be, was Stefan, looking down at her, imploring her to go home. She decided then and there that she and Franz would leave in the morning. That night, a storm passed through the town. Lena never ceased to be amazed by the incredible power of the 4 elements. In this case, water, air, and fire. In the morning, this is what Lena and Franz found: how the other 3 elements had changed the earth. Hoping that these trees blocking the road were the only ones, they crawled over them, only to find more downed trees 20 meters farther on. And after those trees, seemingly endless piles of broken and uprooted trees blocked their progress. They even tried to go into the forest itself, hoping to find some sort of path there. In the end, they realized that they were stuck in their deserted town. That evening, as Lena walked the empty, muddy streets, trying to figure out what to do, she happened to look up and saw this mouth leering down at her, telling her that there was no salvation from the heavens that just the night before had brought destruction. And then she saw this tree miraculously standing, with an endless stream of fireflies rising from the ground, telling her that hope would come from the earth below, the source of all fertility and nourishment. In the days that followed, Lena looked down, not up. She imagined crawling through the earth towards the center, and the incredible uproar that she'd hear in that absolute darkness as planet Earth, in its innermost, reacted to the stresses it was subjected to by life above. What first caught her eye were all the little animals she saw there. And in all of them she saw the dancing bear, chained to its life just like they were chained to theirs. Poor little bastards trying to make it through the day, just like Lena herself was. And then she saw the flowers, the strange, beautiful flowers of Western Russia, growing out of the mud and not flowing down from the heavens. But what really caught her attention was an anthill. It reminded her of a story Stefan had once read to her about how female ants more or less run everything in ant societies. They do all the work, raise the children, and keep everything organized. Males are tolerated at specific times and only for purposes of procreation. A bit extreme, Lena thought, but so far so good. But then she remembered that all ants work only for the well-being of the community. There is no individualism. No one ever does anything for herself alone. Lena did not want to free herself from the control of men only to become chained to community service. Lena's head then became filled with wind-up dolls, couples dancing automatically through the clouds, their movements far beyond their control. And she became filled with an overwhelming longing for freedom. She decided to send Franz home. The war had hardened him, maybe too much, but he would be all right, Lena was sure. She herself would go west, toward the setting sun. But where? Switzerland first came to mind, and that's where she decided to go. And on the day Lena decided to send Franz home, she met Sophia. Out of nowhere, Sophia rode into town with a covered wagon. Lena immediately greeted her and asked her how she'd gotten past all the downed trees. Sophia hadn't even seen them. She'd come on another road that Lena didn't know about. Lena was relieved. She and Franz could leave. Sophia was a Hungarian artist traveling through Europe to paint the war, as she put it. Her wagon was full of paintings, but there were always several paintings of each subject, and they were mostly landscapes or warscapes. Each painting was different in some surprising way from all the others. It was mostly the wildly varied, dramatic colors that changed from one painting to the next. Lena thought that this showed how the war was affecting people. She asked Sophia about it, and that's when she found out about the magic mirror. It looked very much like the makeup mirrors used by many women, but this one was different. It was two-sided in a fascinating way. If someone looked in one side, you could then look in the other side and see the world from that person's point of view for a limited time, which depended upon how intensely the person was looking at him or herself. Sophia said she'd bought the mirror at a flea market in Romania, where many inexplicable things come from. Sophia remarked that she was always amazed at how vain people were. She never had any trouble getting people to look into her mirror. Soldiers, farmers, carpenters, seamstresses, shopkeepers, doctors, nurses, teachers, children, everybody. And she then made paintings from all of these different points of view. And so, the next day, Lena, Franz, and Sophia left Litna-Mesk in Sophia's covered wagon. At a crossroads, Franz went south. Lena and Sophia went west. Lena watched Franz disappear into a forest. Ever since he'd been in the war, Franz didn't talk much, especially about his experiences. For this reason, Lena had been eager to get him to look into Sophia's mirror. She'd been a bit shocked to see things from Franz's point of view. She was now afraid that the lush green forest Franz was entering would appear to him very different. Well, that point of view might help him get home safely, Lena thought. Along the way, Lena watched Sophia work and listened to her explanations about the freedom that art gives. Lena was impressed. Sophia gave Lena this painting when they split up in Konstanz. It was the Lake of Konstanz from Lena's point of view. Sophia went into Germany. Lena went to Zurich. Lena had, of course, often used her ability to make herself invisible at the many checkpoints that she and Sophia had to get through on their way to Konstanz. And she also used it to get into Switzerland. She knew the neutral country was full of refugees and traditionally very welcoming. But the only identification she had was something she couldn't even read, that the Russians had given her. Once in Zurich, she vowed to use her ability only for emergencies. Unfortunately, she had to use it within days of her arrival. Having neither money nor a job, her situation soon became desperate. And when she passed a bakery, she couldn't resist. Sitting on a bench with her loaf of bread, waiting for her hands to become visible again, she looked up and saw a young woman holding a small child, staring right at her. Oh God, Lena thought, I've been caught. Please, please, the woman pleaded. You have powers. I've seen them. You must help. My son is deathly ill. I have no money for a doctor. Lena could see in her eyes the same agonizing desperation she had felt during her struggle to save little Franz from the orphanage in Vienna. She took the child and began to pray, Hail Mary, full of grace. She gave the child back along with the bread and watched the woman disappear into the crowd. Lena rushed to the Grossmünster, searching for a Madonna to implore to heal the little boy. But of course she found none. In desperation, she began to pray in Hungarian, hoping the Holy Mother could hear her. And then she felt a hand on her shoulder. "Come sit with me," a tiny yet somehow otherworldly voice whispered to Lena. And that's how Lena met Emmy Hennings. Emmy took Lena by the hand and led her to a pew where they sat down and stared at the huge empty church. And then Emmy started to speak, a voice like the shriek of a seagull combined with the innocence of a little girl. It also somehow reminded Lena of Joan of Arc. Suddenly the church was filled with all of the Madonna statues Lena had ever seen, assuring her that all would be well in her strange new life. From that time on, Lena was convinced that Emmy had come from another world. And then the bells of the church began to ring, slowly and peacefully, telling Emmy and Lena not to worry. As they left the church, they could see a sailboat on the lake, moving as if it had nowhere to go and all the time in the world to get there. Zurich was definitely a city at peace, Lena thought. Lena then stole another loaf of bread, this time the old-fashioned way, a trick she'd learned from France while traveling through Russia. As she and Emmy devoured the loaf, Emmy explained how she'd cried over the baskets of bread she'd seen at the train station when she first arrived in Zurich. There was no longer any bread to be had in Germany. Lena naively asked Emmy if she'd ever stolen anything. Emmy kissed her on the cheek and said, "Lena, if you want to live here, you have a choice. Huren oder hungern. Whoring or starving." It was then that Lena realized that Emmy was not only the Madonna, she was also the Magdalene. It was from Emmy that Lena learned what real freedom might be. Emmy had experienced all kinds of prisons. She regarded her teenage marriage and pregnancy as a prison. It was as if she'd been buried alive. She'd actually been in prison for stealing from a night visitor, as she put it. For Emmy, even Switzerland was a prison, and the war, to be sure. Lena could definitely agree with that. She even thought God was a prison. Emmy worried constantly about God's mercy and forgiveness of sin. Despite all of this, Lena considered Emmy the most religious person she'd ever met. Emmy even had an altar in the apartment she shared with Hugo Ball. But the most important thing Lena learned from Emmy was that the best way to be free is to forget about your innocence. Desperately trying to preserve one's innocence is the greatest prison of all. Lena was never sure whether living by invisibility rather than prostitution was taking the moral high road, but she no longer worried about it. Where Lena saw Sophia's belief in the freedom of art in action was at the Cabaret Voltaire, started by Emmy, Hugo Ball, and their friends in the old city of Zurich. Lena got a job in what passed for the coat room of the cabaret and could see the extraordinary performances, Dada they called it, through the thick haze of smoke. And when Emmy sang with her heavenly voice, even the drunken students were quiet for a change. After the war, Lena tried to go home again, but everything had changed. She suffered the same fate as Hungarians who tried to go home after leaving the country in 1956. Many old friends pretended not to know her, and the rest were very distant at best. As for Stefan, Andras had been right. Stefan had gone off to war, but he didn't come back, not even his body. Lena fondly remembered how much Stefan had helped her in life. She smiled at the memory of his reaction the day she told him she was going to Vienna. She just hoped that his body hadn't been used to plug a crater in a road somewhere, or that his face hadn't been horribly disfigured. She tried to forget all that and just see Russians dancing on his anonymous grave. Franz had made it home after a few adventures and was smart enough to go to Vienna to look up his grandfather, who had recently died and had left Franz all of his money, should he ever turn up. Franz became a very successful lawyer in Vienna. Rolf and Josef were fine, living with Stefan's elderly parents, and quite happy to take over Stefan's farms. Lena returned to Zurich, where she felt comfortable and where she met Emil, a retired, widowed, and rather eccentric Swiss entrepreneur who had just returned from America after he had lost a lot of money investing in the ill-fated Sky Car. When they first met, Lena had the feeling that Emil had somehow been waiting for her. He only wanted Lena's warmth and cooking in return for all the rest of his money when he died. Lena loved the dirty look she got when she and Emil walked through the city arm in arm. Emil died in 1932. There were, of course, the usual rumors, but Emil's doctors protected Lena. No, he hadn't been poisoned, and there was no sign of foul play. Lena often looked at the tree in Emil's garden, and remembering Masha and Anna's cemetery, wondered whether its branches told the story of his life. She certainly hoped so. After Emil's death, Lena became infected by the Swiss love of travel. Franz received a postcard from her in 1935. As Lena explained on the back, it was a picture of Antarctic orchids. She wrote that they reminded her of the flowers she'd seen in Russia, but were even more beautiful. She explained that she had to see them in person. She was in Buenos Aires and said she was on her way to Punta Arenas, hoping to find a ship to take her to the coast of Antarctica. Neither Franz nor anyone else ever saw or heard from her again. Franz traveled to Zurich in late 1937, his mother having been declared dead, to settle her affairs. In a box containing family photos and notes, he found a little piece of paper in her handwriting. It was undated and read as follows: "Notes for a speech on motherhood, to be given in honor of Josef von Sternberg's visit to Zurich, March 1934. The rest of the page was empty. Franz smiled and put it into the trash.